The long-awaited sequel to Netflix's Castlevania has released, and boy howdy has the reception been confusing. Fans of the channel might know that the original series of Castlevania is probably my favorite thing Netflix has released in a long time. So of course I binged the entire show the day it came out. Today we're going to look at what I thought of Castlevania Nocturne, and we're going to try our best to ignore the weird community response and decide if it's actually a good show or not. Nocturne, as I'll refer to it from here on out, is set 300 years after the events of the original show, and it primarily follows Trevor and Sypha's great-great-great-great-grandson, Richter Belmont. Instead of dealing with Dracula being extremely angry at the world, we're instead thrust into 17th century France, where vampires are hidden in plain sight in aristocracies, and it's only a bit later where we get like a main villain to deal with. For most people, it's hard to have a sequel that takes place in the same universe and jumps this far ahead in time. The Legend of Korra is another great example of this. Conveniently though, Castlevania is set parallel to the real world, so it's somewhat tied to real history, which gives it a backbone. In traditional Castlevania format, the corruption of the church is a huge deal in the story, especially when it's revealed midway through that the Forge Master of this season is also the bishop who runs the local church. The early episodes follow a similar format to the first season of the OG series, collecting a team and showing their respective backstories. The issue in my mind is that by doing this in a shared season with the introduction and the plot of Erzsébet's sun-blotting scheme, the second half of the season feels a bit tightly crammed. I think it's only in the 7th episode where Richter awakens his latent power, which doesn't leave much room for actually dealing with the action and the story at hand. Aside from the general rushed pace of the second half, it's also a bit empty. Erzsébet is just kind of like a big bad villain, and there's not like any personality as opposed to Dracula in the prior series, who had a lot of deep motivations and could actually be like sympathized with from the viewer's point of view. All in all, I'd say the story is serviceable. I can't really say that it's fantastic, and it's the first season of a show that's intended to have, at a minimum, at least 2, so it has a lot of room to get better, but it just simply does its job. During the season, we're also introduced to Olrox, who has sort of like a side plot. It's probably the most compelling thing about the narrative so far, and that just might be my natural edgy draw towards villains and anti-heroes. I'm excited to see where he goes and if he develops more into like an Alucard type role, or if he eventually develops into a full-on villain, having said that he's going to kill Richter in the opening scene. Alright, strap in boys, because pretty much every issue I have with the first season of Nocturne comes down to this. What's the foundation that made the original Castlevania show so excellent? No, not vampires, not a corrupt church, not over-the-top action scenes, and not even having a brown-haired dude with a whip as the protagonist. The characters carried the show. The original trio of Trevor, Sypha, and Alucard are fantastically written in both their exploration of the tropes they're meant to represent, while also having enough personality and realism to feel like an actual group of people rather than voiceless video game characters, which they actually are. I've heard the original show referred to as a Dungeons & Dragons show, not for the thematics, but for how the three characters interact with each other and react to the situations that they're thrown in. Even the side characters, from Hector and Isaac to the likes of Charlemagne, have more interesting and developed stories and personalities than even the most fleshed out characters in Nocturne. So that's it, Nocturne's biggest issue, for me at least. But let's take a look at each of the main characters and see how they stack up. For starters, we have Richter, who feels like he was ripped straight out of a Persona game, not just in design, but in his attitude. For me, I'd say the turning point was during his big moment with Divine Bloodlines, where he awakened his latent magic ability. The writing flounders so hard that he starts saying something about Belmont legacy, and it feels like a very serious moment, and then he just turns around and says, "Fuck it," and blows the vampire's head off. It might be a statement that Richter is a lot less serious than his predecessors, but it also feels slightly disrespectful when he starts to say something about his family and then follows through with, I don't actually have anything. It took me out of the show because it didn't really feel like Richter himself decided not to finish the line, and more like the writers didn't know what to say after the setup, so they just wrote in whatever. Next we have Maria, who I originally referred to as Sypha 2, and she is completely undeserving of that comparison. She feels like she's written to be the protagonist of a young adult novel. She's just angry about the state of the world and doesn't really get any development outside of that. Her summons and rapier combat drew me into her immediately, but then she's damseled for the climax of the season, which is pitiful. Sypha was my favorite character in the OG series, not only for her personality, but because she was never used as a trope damsel. If anything, she was far and away the strongest member of the team, and it was extremely refreshing to have the girl of the group fill that role. Unfortunately, Maria takes like 3 steps back in this regard. Conversely, we have Annette, who is, in my opinion, the best of the main cast. Probably because she gets the most time spent on her backstory, and it's also the most interesting. I haven't played the games these shows are based on, but I think her entire thing of being in tune with the gods of her bloodline is really cool, but I did find it strange how almost every time she used her powers, it was just to turn dirt into swords, when she could very clearly just be a full-time earthbender. I don't have much negative to say, or really all that much positive. Annette is just cool, fairly well written. And finally, for the heroes, we have Edouard. Out of everything the first season gave us, I think that I enjoyed at least the idea of Edouard's story. In life, he was just generally a good dude, your everyday hero, but in death, he's, as far as I'm aware, the first night creature that longs for freedom. And it's an interesting idea to have a night creature that isn't in full servitude of their forge master. He doesn't do much besides sit in a cell and sing opera, but I'm sure it's a growing pain of the first season. And I'm actually really looking forward to him and the other night creature stories and see if they awaken humanity in the coming seasons. The last character I want to give specific time for is Olrox. He's introduced in the opening scene as a big monster that kills Richter's mom, but even from how he speaks to the young Richter at the end of that scene, you can tell that something's off. I knew from the get-go that he wasn't going to be full-on villain. I actually predicted that he was like Vampire Itachi or something, hoping that Richter would gain power to defeat him later, which wasn't too far from the truth if I give myself a little credit. He ended up being a pretty nice guy. He's just also a vampire and lives by a strict code. He only killed Richter's mom because she did something to wrong him personally. And I must say it's really nice to have more LGBT representation in these shows. Weirdly, that's one of the biggest controversies I've seen, and I don't really think a cartoon vampire sexuality is that big of a deal, but there's a lot of very angry, very crazy people on the internet, and we try our best to ignore them. The villains are the weakest part of the show. Erzsébet is a soulless villain and also has the dumbest design I've ever seen, and it's especially bad if you compare to the likes of Dracula or Carmilla, who are both excellent villains in terms of both design and character. Drolta took more of the spotlight as the main villain of the season, which is fair considering they intended for this to lead into a second season with more time spent on Erzsébet, I would assume. Just like the story in general, I found Drolta to be fine. Just fine. However, during the climax, I thought it was really weird that she ceased being a vampire and was just like a fire succubus. I don't get why they gave her a Super Saiyan form. It just didn't really work for me. And actually, having her have an ascended form kind of fucked up the entire pacing of the season. Let's talk about why, and I swear I'll stop ranting right after that. So, for the entire show, we're meeting our cast of characters, we're establishing the villains, and eventually it all culminates in Richter unlocking his potential to explode with magic and effortlessly dispatch a large group of high-ranking vampires. At this point, it's fair for the viewer to question how anyone can stop Richter. He seems like a monster. Then Erzsébet and Drolta both go Super Saiyan, and suddenly Richter can't even scratch them. I find this to be pretty problematic because Richter is already leagues above Maria and Annette in terms of power, just from unlocking this magic ability, and he's already been power crept in the first season by the villains having to have this aura of invulnerability. He can't even damage them. Then, unfortunately, in true cop-out writing fashion, Drolta is killed by an unrelated character who shows up in the last 30 seconds of the season in one hit. Don't get me wrong, I'm extremely happy to have Alucard in Nocturne. He might even be a strong enough character to carry the second season on his own. But I'm not really into how they handled the power scaling for the purposes of storytelling. As it currently stands, we have 3 echelons for our main characters. We have Alucard and maybe Olrox, and then there's a big gap, and then we have Richter, and then there's another big gap, and then Maria and Annette are down there at the bottom. I'm sort of worried that they might end up having a Piccolo situation on their hands. Hopefully the writers can figure this out, but this sort of anime-inspired form unlocking can get out of hand really quickly. Again, compared to the OG series, pretty much every named character was of comparable power, except for Dracula, but he's Dracula. For my closing thoughts, I think that Nocturne honestly did try its best to follow the original Castlevania. I think that the issue for fans currently is that their expectation for the original show was very low, and it ended up being incredible. So when Nocturne was announced, their expectations were set to incredible, and what we got was just okay. I still believe that the writing staff, who by the way have been extremely passionate about this on Twitter, can turn it around with the coming season, or seasons, and I think that it's worth the watch, especially being as short as it is, and it's definitely not deserving of the level of strange hate it's getting. What do you think? I'm interested in hearing your opinion in the comment sections, and I read every single one of them, so let me know. Thanks for watching this short look into Nocturne Season 1. If you liked the video, I have 2 more about the original Castlevania on screen now. Shout out to my Patreon subscriber, singular, kick asterisk. If you want to support the channel, my Patreon link is at the top of the description, and I think I have some pretty cool and unique benefits, so check it out if you want. Anyway, I'll see you next time.